Carmen Ejogo, you co-star in Selma as Coretta Scott King, the wife of Martin Luther King, and you've actually played her before in the HBO movie Boycott in 2001. How did the opportunity come about to play her again?
So Ava was aware of my work, and I think she'd actually seen Boycott, but that didn't make it a no-brainer for her that, oh, well, this is clearly my Coretta for this project. She was interested, but I had to fly myself out to meet her in LA and to audition with David. And I think she was very clear about what she was looking for in terms of craftsmanship and in terms of approach to acting, but also just in terms of energy. She really brought together a group of people that were very much aligned in terms of sort of just spirit and approach to life. So that was as important to Ava, I think. I see why, because I think it's something that has made this film really stand out, and a very visceral experience, and a very honest experience for people that have seen the film so far, because I think a lot of that spirit really comes out on screen, and I think that she turned us what was initially quite a cold script in a lot of ways, that was mostly focusing on the LBJ MLK relationship. She brought in a degree of humanity and a lot of female characters. In fact, all the female characters. There were no female characters. There was no real Coretta storyline or narrative in the script when she first got hold of it. And so I think that's how I came on board, because I think she just felt that there was the right spirit and the right approach to the work.
That does seem like a significant aspect of the film. I mean, having it directed by Ava Duvernay, who's been getting so much acclaim for it now. It's rare for a black woman to be in a position to be getting as much attention as she's been getting for a motion picture. And so you think that she brought that kind of a female presence to it that we haven't really necessarily appreciated about the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think she holds her own with any male director, and I think the way she approached this set, for the most part, was no different than any A-list, and I'll put her in that category because I think that's where she belongs. Any A-list director that I've had the privilege of working with, they've all been male. I've never worked with a female director before, and she could stand her own. I mean, she could hold her own against any of them. But I do think there is something that she brought that was particular and feminine and female. There was just an attention to certain kinds of details. I mean, on a very trivial level, as a character on screen where appearance is everything for someone like Coretta Scott King, to have a feminine and a female eye behind the camera, and just to be conscious all the time about those sort of things. I've never had a male director, come up to me and just sort of get my hair just right before a take, or just want to make sure that the makeup was exactly right, or those sorts of things that seem in some ways trivial but actually can make the difference in terms of what I'm then focusing on and what an audience is appreciating on screen. And beyond that, I think the way she handles interpersonal relationships, I think really, really cool, interesting guys have the capacity to really understand relationships in a very astute and knowing way. But there is something called female intuition that she absolutely possesses, and that she has written into the dynamics between, for example, Martin and Coretta on screen, and that permeates this whole film, that I think is absolutely a feminine touch that she uniquely brings to this project.
Even though Ava might have, been looking for, her own, Coretta Scott King, and not necessarily, asking you to bring exactly what you brought to the previous film, did having that experience playing her before give you more confidence in playing her this time? Was there any additional research or preparation involved playing her in this time around?
Yeah, I definitely came into this project a little cocky, because I had the ultimate blessing. I met Coretta after making Boycott, and she'd seen my performance in that, and she totally approved. So I felt like, okay, well, if Coretta thought I did a good job, then, maybe I am the right person to do this again. But the truth is, I really wouldn't have been interested in playing her a second time if it wasn't in some way a challenge and different. And thankfully, the way Ava had approached the script and wanted to approach the relationship was markedly different to what I had done in Boycott, which was the HBO film I did about 15 years ago. In Boycott, I'm playing Coretta Scott King in 1955, when Martin and Coretta had really been just thrust into the position of leadership. They were still kind of finding their feet, making their way, figuring out, what they where they were going, as they were galvanizing support for the Montgomery bus boycott. The marriage was in a different place. There was a level of optimism about what the future held. There wasn't quite the same weight of death hanging over the couple every single day. There were definitely death threats, and in fact, the house was bombed during that period in the 50s. But it wasn't quite the same day in, day out experience that it had become by 1965. So I think the Coretta I got to play in Selma is a much wearier, burdened personality. And I actually think that she was probably quite frustrated in herself, in that she was so dynamic and so brilliant. She's the one that showed Martin Luther King and introduced him to ideas of pacifism and philosophies of Gandhi. She was an intellect, she was an academic, she was a singer, she was a progressive, a feminist, and in some ways by 1965 she's really kind of been reduced to a mother and a wife and somebody that's a figurehead and who has to maintain a certain self-image, and there's a facade and a veneer that she's having to maintain and stay true to. And somehow I think a lot of who she was in terms of this rounded, dynamic woman got very sort of subdued and suppressed. So there is so much that's different about the Coretta of 1965 to who I got to play the first time round, which is why I wanted to do it. I can't think of any other actor that's played the same character twice in their career. So, it was bound to be an interesting idea. And it was certainly the way that Ava approached the material made it a no-brainer.
Well, you mentioned that the Coretta Scott King you're playing is in a different place in this film as opposed to the previous one, but you yourself are also in a different place in your life and in your career. Did the character and did this story sort of have a different significance to you now than it did to you then?
Mm. Absolutely, absolutely. I've definitely had a personal journey that in some ways has mirrored what happened for Coretta in some ways. I became a mother and I had to really grapple with the idea of, not having the career that I had embarked on before having kids, and really had to sort of make my peace with that and figure out how to be somebody that was okay with the idea of maybe not being the creative being in terms of acting anymore. And so I definitely had gone through a lot of the same woes and anxieties, I think. I mean, not to the extreme or degree that Coretta would have, because something that was really palpable, in my opinion, and something that I think she was living with as well, was the idea that she might not have Martin around for long. I think she knew that by 1965, that it was a matter of time that he was going to be killed or die or something would go down. And sure enough, it was only 3 years later that he was assassinated. So I mean, I haven't lived that kind of traumatic day in, day out, anxiety, but there are definitely other parallels. Becoming a mum is its own trauma in many ways. It's a great experience, but particularly in this industry where women aren't really not so readily welcome back into the fold when they've had kids. You kind of you're made to feel at times that you're past your sell-by date and you haven't got a lot to offer anymore, which is obviously ridiculous. But it does make you worry as to whether you've sabotaged your own career by having a family. I wouldn't have wanted it any other way, and I'm so glad that I made the choice that I did. But it's funny, I see girls now who have really waited so late in their lives and in their, that are in now like their late 30s before they decided, okay, I've got to a certain place with the work, I can now have the family finally. And I kind of did it the other way around. I definitely started younger, but I'm still here and I'm doing some of the best work I've ever done. So I guess I'm proof that it can work out.
Yeah, it definitely has. And you've talked about a little bit how we see this weariness in Coretta, this anxiety about potentially losing Martin, that she eventually, of course, does. And we do get a sense of that relationship and that conflict in her and in her marriage in this film. And in particular, there's this one scene after they're getting these phone calls and they're being threatened, and they really have a reckoning almost, about their marriage and what their relationship means to them. It's a
Right.
really emotional scene. Tell me a little bit about filming that one.
Yeah, that was the last film I got. That was the last scene that I got to film for the movie. So it wasn't done chronologically, which had its advantages actually, in that, I'd spent a whole film schedule quite disconnected from the group because my work is really just with David. So I didn't really get to know everybody as well as they got to know each other. And it all felt very appropriate because that was really Coretta's experience. She wasn't really in the groundswell in the same way that the Diane Nashes or the Amelia Boyntons or the James Bevels were. She was much more peripheral. She would come in to help out when she was asked, but that wasn't very often. So by the time I got to film this last scene, even though it appears in the middle of the movie, there was so much pent up anxiety and desire to be heard and to be part of Martin's experience, and David's experience as an actor, and to be part of the film in some real way. So it turned out to be a blessing that the scene was not filmed chronologically. What I most appreciated from a very sort of personal point of view, in terms of my arc, was that scene was the moment in which I was able to expose so many more emotional dynamics and sides of this woman. What I was trying to do with the scenes prior to it and after it was really stay true to the Coretta that I got to meet, which was somebody that had really bought into a sort of veneer of themselves and was very self-protective and really didn't reveal a lot until she felt safe and that you were part of the sort of inner circle. And so that scene was very important because it gave me permission, knowing that scene existed in the film where I was going to get the opportunity to really sort of explode in terms of emotion, allowed me to play things so much more subtly and nuanced prior and after, and know that it wouldn't just, those had to be two-dimensional in some way. Those other scenes had to retain a certain two-dimensional dimension to them, because that is actually the way that Coretta started to live her life, was this sort of two-dimensional veneer and facade. But there was so much more going on, and so thankfully that central scene between me and David allowed so much more of those colors to emerge. And David and I think from the very start, we were not going to shy away from being messy and from being utterly authentic and truthful to what we thought would be the depth of emotion and conflict that these two people would have been experiencing in a conversation like that. And thank goodness we had a director like Ava, who evidenced in her other movies, she's a master at being really authentic in those kinds of very intimate relationship scenes. She understands that you have to be honest rhythmically to a scene like that. So she's not trying to force certain sort of Hollywood patterns of, he says this, then she says that, and then, it's a certain crescendo that we all reach. No, she understands that there's an awkwardness that there are pregnant pauses that happen in that sort of thing, in that sort of experience, that sort of moment. So we were in great hands to allow ourselves to feel confident enough and safe enough to be honest. That's what I think we were essentially being, just honest about what the words were demanding of us.
One of the other interesting aspects about reprising this role is that you not only get to revisit the Coretta Scott King character for yourself, but you get to play against a different Martin Luther King, and maybe a different him at a different point of his life, but also a different actor. Do you think David Oyelowo had a different approach to playing Martin Luther King? That sort of that dynamic felt different?
Without a doubt. I mean, he had to. It's a different script. It's a different time period. Martin is also a different man in 1965 relative to 1955. So it had to be a different approach. And I know that Ava and David really wanted to illuminate the aloneness of this man, the fact that he really, as much as he had this galvanized, this ability to create an amazing collection of people around him, and it really was a team effort. A lot of the strategic thought processes and decision making and moments of doubt were lonely and alone spaces that he had to inhabit, and that's something I think that we don't necessarily think about when we think of Martin Luther King. We don't think of those moments of doubt and the fact that he at times felt like he was on the wrong path and he didn't know what he was doing. And we forget that he was thrust into the position of leadership in the first place. This is not something that he was born into doing. It's easy to sort of retrospectively think, well, this man was clearly, there was nothing, he was made to do this job. This was clearly what he was born to do. And in fact, not necessarily. He really had to rise to the occasion. I think this script and the intention in this film as well was just very much to illuminate and to magnify the normality and the ordinariness of these people, including the Kings. They had the same domestic issues as so many of us go through. They had the same worries, the same anxieties, the same flaws, all of these things that they had to grapple with. I think it makes them even more heroic as people, that with all of those contradictions and conflicts within, they were still able to achieve so much. I think essentially what we were always avoiding was the icon, the sort of the sort of man built in stone, I think that Ava succeeded in that goal.
I think Selma would have already felt relevant in 2014, and last year the Supreme Court basically did away with the Voting Rights Act and everything that that they fought for in Selma in those marches. But I don't think, in addition, anyone could have predicted that it would also coincide with what's been happening this year in the U.S. and Ferguson and Staten Island, and protesting still, for more equal treatment of blacks. What do you think modern audiences can take away from this film about sort of protesting and the struggle for rights?
Yeah, I mean, it's this outrageously prescient. Sorry, I just had to plug my phone in. It was about to die. If you're wondering why I've changed the scenery. Yeah, I think it's incredibly prescient, and none of us really knew, obviously, while we were making it, that it would be so pertinent in this very moment in time. What I think you take away from this film, it was certainly my experience, is to be inspired to want to do more. It's not, it's a very heavy film in some ways, but you don't come out depressed and, wishing things were better. You recognize that it can be better if I make the decision to find my voice. And I think to be in a project while there is a real desire on a street level across the country, around the world, I think this film has universal relevance. To be part of a film that has this kind of Relevance is really a very I've never had an experience like this before. I think what people can take away from it is quite literally a how to civilly and peacefully protest and come to and also see that it can actually result in something that is meaningful. There can be real policy change. It can really have impact. Just to be reminded that it takes participation. You can't be apathetic about this stuff. You can't sort of sit back in a position of comfort and expect others to do the work for you. You have to be involved. I think it's all inspiring, this movie, and I think there are so many applications for it for so many people, and I really do think it can travel globally in so many ways, because essentially, beyond the race issue, this is really essentially a story about people finding their voice against the whoever the oppressor might be, whether it's corporate power, taking away workers' rights, whether it's people on the streets of Hong Kong trying to find their space, against, there are so many examples. Ukraine, Iran, Egypt is still trying to find its place. Iraq is back, has regressed into a space that, people are feeling disempowered again. This movie has so much potential to inspire and to encourage people to find their voice and to know that as a collective, people power is massive. It really amounts to something. It's not just like some hippie idea that, it can actually change the world. It really can. It happened.
Yeah, well, and Selma has been getting a lot of recognition for for this award season. It's nominated at the Golden Globes and Critics' Choice Awards. You've been nominated yourself at the Independent Spirit Awards and the Image Awards. What has this whole award season whirlwind been like for you? I know before we started, you were at an Academy event, weren't you?
Yeah. I mean, it's all new to me, so I'm sort of learning on my feet and sort of figuring out, okay, well, that's how this works. That this is clearly a bit of a game over here, and this is, I mean, I think ultimately that this kind of attention in this sort of a way, the whole awards accolade moment, is most useful in the sense that it puts a spotlight on this film, which will hopefully become bums on seats and will turn into box office, and that's relevant because that's ultimately what determines whether a film like this gets made again in this way, with a black female director like Ava Duvernay at the helm, with an attention, with so many people of color behind the camera. Bradford Young, who's this brilliant DP, who also has worked on some other films that are up for accolades at this, during this season. Costume, head of costume, is a twice nominated Oscar nominee. We've got so many amazing talents behind the camera as well. That's a completely unique experience for me. I've never been in that situation where so many people of color were inhabiting and telling their own story. For this to happen again, we need things like award attention. And so as much as it feels fabulous, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't, to be appreciated by my peers and by the industry and by the public, that in some ways is where it's most valuable, because it's just, you can't get a bigger spotlight than the whole awards moment.
Well, I want to congratulate you on the film and on this awards moment that is not finished yet. There is still a couple of months to go, and potential Oscar nominations down the road for the film and potentially for your performance. So I want to wish you the best of luck on all that.
Thank you so much. It's been fun.